India, and the buzz around, of course, continues to be on G20, the G20 Summit, which will see head of states already on their way, en route, perhaps will be landing tomorrow or day after. Preparations are on and in full swing.
So, Shweta, a couple of dampeners, if I can call it, on the G20 Summit 2023, the much famed, talked about and prepared for event starting in Delhi 2 days from now. Now, number one, Xi Jinping has
not
dropped
making
out.
it.
Right. Now, this, of course, is a huge political setback when it comes to geopolitics, not just for India, but also the already sort of, cold relations between the West and China, US, particularly US and China. I think another dampener is that the First Lady of the US, Jill Biden, is down with COVID. Thankfully, President Biden has so far tested negative, but I think that is also going to be something that is going to keep India on tenterhooks, for the next 2 days or so, until President Joe Biden finally arrives in Delhi for the G20 summit. So I think two dampeners there. Of course, no news there. Putin, of course, we knew earlier also is not going to travel for the G20 summit. So when it comes to global leadership of the top 20 countries in the world, we already have two confirmed dropouts, which of course come by way of Putin and Xi Jinping. Now, I think India, of course, particularly is likely to hope for certain imperative outcomes from the G20 summit. But the economy track meetings that happened yesterday in a run-up to the G20 summit, again, have some damp news. One coming by way of cryptocurrencies. We still haven't been able to draft a framework, and this is something which again has been in the works for many months now, and there was supposed to be this paper to be drafted by India with a clear framework, taking inputs from finance ministers of other G20 countries to have a clear framework for governing cryptocurrencies going forward. And while that paper in some form apparently has been made ready, it's called a synthesis paper, it does not seem to be yet something which can be held as a global standard for cryptocurrencies, right? And of course, these discussions are happening on the economy track of G20. Cut to another important economy issue is this whole debate on debt restructuring. And it would have been up for debate. I think it would have been a very heated discussion had Chinese Premier Xi Jinping traveled to India for G20. But in his absence, again, I think
in his replacement, in fact, there will be representation.
Of course, Mr.
From China.
Li, right, is the replacement. But I know, I'm saying, in the absence of Xi Jinping himself arriving for the G20 summit, I think this entire debate on debt restructuring for South Asian economies and also some African economies is something which has been, hotly debated for quite some time now. The entire multilateral banks, sort of, the way they lend to these developing economies which are in dire need, and we've seen many instances of this, including not so friendly neighbors, including Pakistan, and more friendly nations, including Sri Lanka, which have received enormous amounts of debt from World Bank, IMF and these multilateral agencies. But I think what is critical also is that China has been a great lender to a lot of emerging economies and a lot of dwindling economies, if I might add, where there has been a cash crunch, there has been a BOP crisis, and China has stepped in as this sort of, big brother of the, of the Asian region and provided debt to a lot of these emerging countries which are facing economic headwinds. And these countries obviously are finding it hard because of the overall macro global environment and inflation and the overall picture not so kind. They're finding it difficult to repay their debt. And I think G20 was to come together and arrive at a debt restructuring plan. And this restructuring plan is something that China would have definitely opposed to, simply because it has vested interest by way of recovering that interest, that loan and the interest on that loan. So in the absence of China, any sort of debt restructuring is unlikely to go through. But let's see if there is some sort of a consensus that the other G20 leaders can arrive at when it comes to this pertaining issue of debt restructuring.
All right. And we'll, of course, continue to bring you all the G20 updates right here on News9.